My homeowners association dug a 5-foot-deep trench around my entire house. You heard me correctly. They didn't put up a decorative fence or plant a privacy hedge. They dug a literal medieval-style moat, severing my home from the rest of the world. And the name for this project, this act of topographical aggression? They're calling it, with a straight face, Phase 1 of the Community Beautification and Drainage Project. I'm calling it a prison. They have, with the cold efficiency of a hostile foreign power, put me under house arrest on my own property. I am cutting myself off from my mailbox, my car, my trash cans, from everything that constitutes an everyday life. They offered no warning, no temporary bridge, not even a simple plank of wood. They just dug. 1 minute I was asleep in my bed in my safe, quiet home, and the next I was the warden of my own island jail. This isn't a bad dream that I'll wake up from, heart-pounding, relieved to see my familiar bedroom. This is my new reality. This is day 1. And as I stand at my window staring at the raw, gaping wound in the earth that was once my front lawn, I honestly have no idea how this is going to end. Before my home became a fortified island, a bizarre parody of a castle, my life was almost aggressively every day. I'm not an activist or a troublemaker. I'm just a regular person. I work a remote job from a spare bedroom, I pay my mortgage on time, and my primary goal in neighborhood relations is not to annoy my neighbors and hope for the same in return. I bought this house because I fell in love with it on the first visit. It wasn't just the structure, it was the feeling. The way the enormous old oak tree out front dappled the lawn with shade and the specific slant of morning sun that filled the kitchen made the whole space feel optimistic. It was my little piece of quiet in a loud world. The only catch? The one dark cloud in my blue sky life? The Homeowners Association, the HOA. 3 letters that can strike a unique kind of terror into the heart of any homeowner. 3 letters that can make even the most easygoing person break out in a cold sweat. Our HOA wasn't a functioning democracy of neighbors looking out for each other. It was an absolute monarchy, and we were its unwitting subjects. The queen of this beige, meticulously manicured kingdom was the president. A woman whose name I've changed to protect the guilty, but whom we'll call Brenda. Brenda didn't just enforce the CCNRs, the covenants, conditions, and restrictions. She lived and breathed them. They were her scripture. To her, a blade of grass that dared to grow a 1/4 inch taller than its comrades was a sign of creeping anarchy. A string of festive lights left up a day past the arbitrary deadline signaled the imminent collapse of civilized society. She wasn't obsessed with building community. She was obsessed with exerting control, all under the guise of protecting property values, a phrase she wielded like a scepter. My personal journey into Brenda's crosshairs, the one that ultimately led to the moat, began with something so trivial, so utterly ridiculous. It feels absurd even to say it out loud, a welcome mat. It was a simple, tasteful mat. It was gray, with a white border, and in a clean, modern font it just said, "Welcome." Apparently, the font wasn't on the pre-approved list for home accessories. I am not kidding. Less than a week after I posted it, I received a formal letter in a crisp HOA-branded envelope. Inside, complete with a color photograph of the offending mat like evidence in a criminal trial, was a notice informing me of my violation and a $25 fine. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud because I thought it had to be a prank from a neighbor. I called Brenda, expecting a shared chuckle and a quick apology for the mix-up. The chuckle never came. Instead, I was treated to a 5-minute, dead-serious lecture on the critical importance of aesthetic uniformity. She spoke of the mat as if it were a piece of subversive graffiti. She warned me of further action if the violation wasn't cured within 7 days. The call ended with my jaw on the floor. That was my first authentic taste of the HOA's special brand of bureaucratic insanity. I fought it, of course. My sense of justice, however petty the issue, wouldn't let it go. I wrote formal letters citing the lack of any rule about font styles in the bylaws. I even attended a board meeting held in a sterile, windowless room in the community clubhouse. I was the only homeowner there. It was just me, facing Brenda and her 2 silent, nodding board cronies across a folding table. I made my case logically and calmly. It was like arguing with a brick wall. They voted unanimously to uphold the fine. I lost. The welcome mat was banished, replaced with a soul-crushingly boring Brenda-approved beige rectangle that said nothing at all. It was a tiny, ridiculous battle, but it set the stage for the war to come. I had questioned her authority. I had refused to bow and obey, and in Brenda's perfectly uniform world, that made me a problem. A few months later, the emails began. They were lengthy, rambling dispatches from Brenda, filled with vague corporate jargon about a new grand plan. She had christened it the Community Drainage and Beautification Project. The stated goal was twofold: to fix a minor, occasional waterlogging issue on a street clear on the other side of the neighborhood, and to enhance the natural aesthetic of the entire community. It sounded harmless, if a bit pretentious. Boring, even. The proposal mentioned significant earthworks and redefined water flow channels. Still, these alarming phrases were buried in so much fluffy language about synergy and forward-thinking landscape architecture that nobody really paid attention. We all just collectively rolled our eyes and figured they'd plant some new azalea bushes or install a French drain somewhere. The colossal red flag that I, and everyone else, should have seen was the complete and total lack of specifics. There was no detailed scope of work, no projected cost, and most importantly, no assessment of the project's impact on our individual homes. Our HOA bylaws are crystal clear on this point. Any capital improvement project costing over $10,000 requires a formal, detailed proposal and a 2/3 majority vote from the homeowners. There was never a proposal, and there was undoubtedly no vote. When a few of us, including myself, replied to the email thread asking for a budget and a timeline, Brenda waved it off with digital dismissiveness. She claimed it was critical maintenance, a supposed loophole that allowed the board to bypass the homeowner vote entirely. "We're simply repairing and optimizing existing drainage infrastructure," she wrote back, and I could practically feel the condescending smile that never reached her eyes. She was lying through her teeth. There was no existing drainage infrastructure on my side of the neighborhood. They weren't repairing anything. They were planning to build something monstrous from scratch, but we didn't know that yet. We assumed, foolishly, that there was a limit to the madness. We figured even our power-mad HOA wouldn't do anything truly catastrophically insane. We were so wrong. I'm a light sleeper, always have been. So, the low, persistent rumble that started just after dawn on a Tuesday morning was more than enough to pull me out of a deep sleep. It was a deep, guttural sound, the kind you feel in your teeth and in the floorboards. My first groggy thought was that it was a garbage truck running early. I rolled over, pulling a pillow over my head. But the sound didn't stop or move on. It got louder, closer, and was soon joined by the piercing, rhythmic beep, beep, beep of a heavy vehicle backing up, seemingly right outside my bedroom window. Finally, I threw off the covers, a wave of pure annoyance washing over me. I stomped to the window and peeked through the blinds, fully expecting to see a city utility truck. But my brain couldn't process what I was actually seeing. A massive yellow excavator was parked on my front lawn, its treads leaving deep, muddy wounds in the grass I'd just mowed 2 days ago. Its giant, articulated arm was methodically scooping up vast chunks of my yard, my soil, my grass, my flower beds, and dumping them into a waiting dump truck. They were digging a trench, not a small ditch for pipes or cables. This was a massive, gaping wound in the earth that stretched the entire length of my property line, from one end of my house to the other. I threw on the first clothes I could find, jeans and a sweatshirt, and ran outside, my heart pounding with a mixture of confusion and rage. A foreman in a bright orange vest and a white hard hat saw me coming and immediately held up a hand, stopping me in my tracks. "Sorry, ma'am, you gotta stay back." "Safety regulations. Safety! Safety! What in the world are you doing to my yard? Who approved this?" I yelled, my voice barely audible over the roar of the diesel engine. He just shrugged, a gesture of total indifference. "HOA project, ma'am. The work order instructs digging a 5-foot perimeter channel. Phase 1. A channel? It's a moat! You've dug me in! How am I supposed to leave my house?" I gestured wildly at my driveway, now a concrete pier leading to nowhere. "My car is in the garage. How do I get to work? How do I get my mail?" He pointed a thick thumb back toward the street, a motion that clearly said, "Not my problem. Not my department. My job's to dig." And with that, he turned his back on me and walked away. I stood there, utterly stunned, watching in impotent fury as they systematically created my own personal Alcatraz. By noon, the crew and their equipment had departed. All that was left was the ringing silence and the trench. It was about 5 feet deep and at least 4 feet across at its narrowest point. The earth was piled high on the street side, creating a muddy wall. My driveway was a useless slab. My front path, once a welcoming walkway, now ended in a sheer, muddy drop. My sanctuary had become an island. I was, for all intents and purposes, a prisoner in my own home. The first 5 days were an exercise in escalating absurdity, a surreal montage of daily tasks turned into Herculean challenges. First up, the mail. My mailbox stood on the far side of the chasm like a tiny metal sentinel mocking me. I scouted the perimeter of my new island looking for the narrowest point. I found a spot near the big oak tree, took a 20-foot running start across my lawn, and leaped. I landed hard, skidding on the grass on the other side, my ankles screaming in protest. I grabbed my mail, a credit card bill, and a pizza coupon, the universe laughing, and then made the treacherous jump back. This was not a sustainable, long-term solution. Then came trash day. A task I usually completed without a single thought became a logistical nightmare. I had to empty my big rolling bin into smaller, lighter kitchen bags, tie them up, and literally throw them one by one across the trench toward the curb. I must have looked like a complete lunatic to anyone driving by. Half of them didn't make it, tumbling down into the muddy bottom. I had to fetch my longest garden rake and spend 20 minutes fishing them out, getting covered in grime and whatever was leaking from the bags. It wasn't very comfortable. Walking my dog, Buster, became a tragicomedy. Buster, a golden retriever with an unshakable belief that the world is a wonderful place, would run to the front door, tail wagging with frantic energy, then stop dead at the edge of the trench, letting out a series of confused, heartbroken whines. Our walks became sad, repetitive laps around the house, a constant perimeter check of our shared prison. He would look at me with such profound betrayal in his eyes as if asking, "Why did you break the world?" The absolute breaking point was groceries. On day 4, I ran out of coffee and milk, an actual state of emergency in my world. I placed a huge online grocery order, and in the special instructions, I wrote in all caps, "My house is completely surrounded by a large, deep trench. There is no way to reach the front door. Please call me on arrival." An hour later, I got a notification on my phone. "Your order has been delivered." I ran to the window, a sliver of hope in my heart, only to see 30 bags of groceries sitting neatly arranged on the far side of the ditch, a glorious feast for the neighborhood ants and squirrels. The delivery driver had apparently seen the chasm, shrugged, and decided, close enough. It took me 2 solid hours to ferry everything across. I found a long piece of plywood in the garage and rigged it up as a makeshift slide, pushing bags down one side and then hauling them up the other. By the end, I was covered in mud, drenched in sweat, and on the absolute verge of tears. It wasn't just the physical effort. It was the blatant, soul-crushing disregard for my existence that was so infuriating. By day 5, I knew I couldn't live like this. The constant jumping and throwing wasn't just undignified. It was genuinely dangerous. I was one slip away from a broken ankle or worse. With a new sense of grim determination, I walked through my neighbor's yard to get to the street, drove to the nearest hardware store, and bought 2 sturdy 8-foot-long 2x10 planks. After a great deal of effort, I managed to lay them across the narrowest part of the trench, creating a wobbly but functional bridge. As I took my first tentative balancing steps across, a wave of pure, unadulterated triumph washed over me. I had built a bridge. I had reconnected myself to the world. I thought I had outsmarted them. I had forgotten who I was dealing with. My small, hard-won victory lasted for exactly 24 hours. On the afternoon of day 6, after a blessedly normal trip to retrieve my mail, I walked back across my rickety plank bridge to find a crisp, white envelope taped to my front door. The official HOA logo was in the top left corner. My stomach dropped. Someone from the HOA had to have crossed my bridge, my lifeline, for the sole purpose of delivering a violation notice for that very same bridge. The irony was so thick it was suffocating. With trembling hands, I tore it open. The letter inside was as cold, sterile, and predictable as I expected. It formally informed me that an unapproved structure, my bridge, had been erected on my property in direct violation of Article 7. Section 4 of the CCNRs, which apparently governed all forms of construction, regardless of whether they were temporary or not. My lifeline was officially a violation. But it was the next part, the paragraph below the initial citation, that made my blood run cold. The notice included a $100 fine for the unapproved structure. Then, printed in an aggressive, bold font, it stated, "Please be advised, this violation is deemed a continuous health and safety hazard by the board. Pursuant to the penalty schedule, the fine will be compounded daily until the unapproved structure is removed." They were threatening to double the fine every single day. $100 on day 1, then $200 on day 2, then $400, $800, $1,600. At the time, I had no idea if this was even legal. All I felt was a rising tide of raw panic. I did a quick, terrifying mental calculation. Within a week, I'd owe over $12,000. Within 2, it would be a life-ruining number. It was a gun to my head. Tear down your only way out and strand yourself on your island or go bankrupt. I had to confront the architect of this madness face to face. I grabbed my phone, opened the voice recorder app, hit record, and marched with grim purpose over to Brenda's perfect trench-free house 2 streets over. She opened the door wearing a pastel cardigan, her face arranged into a mask of polite concern. "Brenda, we need to talk," I said, my voice shaking slightly with adrenaline. I held up the violation notice. "You fined me?" "Ah, yes," she said, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "The unapproved bridge. I was hoping you'd remove it promptly." "A fine? For a bridge? You dug a 5-foot trench around my house, trapping me, and now you're fining me for trying to cross it?" The absurdity of the words hung in the air between us. Her smile tightened, becoming a thin, hard line. "The rules are the rules, Michael. That thing you've constructed is an unapproved structure, and frankly, it's a liability. If someone were to fall off your little homemade bridge and injure themselves, the HOA could be sued. We have to protect the association. You could be sued for digging a giant, unfenced pit around a home." I shot back, my voice rising. "This is the hazard. How am I supposed to get my mail? Or my groceries? How am I supposed to exist?" And then she delivered the line I will never, ever forget. A line so divorced from reality it felt like something from a surrealist play. "The trench is not an obstacle, Michael," she said, her voice calm, patient, and impossibly condescending, as if explaining something simple to a child. "It's a water feature. It's part of the community's aesthetic enhancement. You should be grateful. Once the high-capacity pumps are installed and the decorative river stones are laid, it will be quite beautiful. Your crude bridge is ruining the intended visual flow. A water feature." She called this muddy, hazardous ditch a water feature. I was utterly speechless. It was in that moment that I realized she had completely detached from reality. She wasn't just a power-hungry stickler for rules. She was living in her own delusion, a world where a 5-foot trench was a babbling brook. There is no arguing with that level of insanity. I turned and walked away without another word. As if summoned by Brenda's dark magic, a massive thunderstorm rolled through that night. The sky opened up and it rained for hours. I woke up the next morning to a new and improved horror. My water feature had arrived. The trench was now full, a moat of churning, brown, stagnant water. My plank bridge, my only escape, was now slick with a layer of slimy algae, bowing dangerously just inches above the disgusting soup. A few days later, the smell hit, a pungent, swampy odor of decay and rot that hung heavy in the air. Then came the mosquitoes. Not just a few, but thick biblical clouds of them. The beautification project had successfully turned my front yard into a malarial swamp. My immediate neighbors, who had initially been watching with detached amusement, were starting to get furious. The edge of their pristine lawns was beginning to erode and slump into the trench, and the mosquito swarms had declared war on the entire block. One evening, my neighbor from across the street, a retired civil engineer named Bob, came over. He stood at the edge of the chasm, his arms crossed, his face grim. "This is certifiably insane," he said, shaking his head. "I've been a civil engineer for 40 years. The hydrostatic pressure from a trench this full of water, this close to your house, could seriously compromise your foundation. It can lead to shifting, cracking, catastrophic failure. This isn't a beautification project. It's an act of gross structural negligence. His words, coming from an expert, were a lifeline. It wasn't just me being dramatic. This was objectively and professionally dangerous. The tide, I realized, was finally starting to turn. Okay, I need to pause the story for a moment. I'm literally looking out my window at a moat of mosquito-infested swamp water. My house is slowly being undermined, and the HOA is fining me into oblivion for building a bridge to survive. And the president, Brenda, literally told me to my face that this pit of despair was a water feature. Have you ever dealt with an HOA or a neighbor who seemed to be living in their own little reality, utterly detached from the world everyone else inhabits? Please share your own horror stories in the comments. I could really use the support right now, and reading your stories will help me feel like I'm not totally alone in this madness. If you want to see how this absolute disaster unfolds, make sure you subscribe, because believe it or not, it gets even crazier from here. The exact moment my panic and anger transformed into cold, calculated action was on day 16. It was a Wednesday. My mom was supposed to come over for lunch. She's in her 70s and uses a cane for balance. As I spoke with her on the phone that morning, confirming our plans, the reality of the situation hit me like a physical punch to the gut. "Honey, how am I supposed to get across that ditch you told me about?" she asked, her voice laced with genuine confusion. "I can't walk across a couple of slippery boards." "I'll fall." She was right. Of course she was right. I had been so hyper-focused on my own daily struggles, the groceries, the trash, the mail, that I hadn't fully processed the more profound, more painful implications of my imprisonment. I was completely cut off from my family. I couldn't have guests. My home, once a place of welcome, was now inaccessible. I had to tell my mom we had to cancel, and hearing the profound disappointment and worry in her voice broke something deep inside me. This was no longer just an inconvenience. It wasn't a ridiculous story to tell my friends. It was an attack on my life and my relationships. The war was officially on. That weekend, I turned my dining room table into a war room. I started by methodically documenting everything. I created a timeline, chronicling every event, every email, every violation notice. I transcribed the audio recording of my conversation with Brenda, her water feature comment now a centerpiece of my evidence. I took hundreds of photos from every conceivable angle. The trench when it was dry, the trench when it was full of disgusting water, my precarious plank bridge, the swarms of mosquitoes clinging to my window screens, the erosion creeping toward my neighbors' lawns. I was building a case brick by painstaking brick. Then I dove headfirst into the law. I spent hours online, fueled by coffee and pure rage. I downloaded and printed our state's Property Owners Association Act. I found the official, filed copy of our HOA's own governing documents, the CC&Rs and the bylaws. I went through them page by page, highlighter in hand, reading every line of dense legalese. And slowly, like a secret code revealing itself, I started to find them, the weapons I needed. First, the fines. I found the section in the state law that governs explicitly how HOAs can levy fines. And there it was, in beautiful, unambiguous black and white. In many jurisdictions, including my own state, there are strict caps on the amounts HOAs can fine for non-health and safety violations. More importantly, the practice of compounding or exponentially doubling a fine daily is explicitly prohibited. It's considered an illegal and predatory penalty. The HOA's primary threat, the financial gun to my head that had caused me so much panic, was nothing more than an illegal scare tactic. The wave of relief was so intense it almost made me dizzy, and a cold, sharp fury immediately replaced it. They had been trying to terrorize me with an empty threat. Second, the vote. As I had remembered from my initial glance months ago, our bylaws clearly state that any non-essential capital improvement project with a total cost exceeding $10,000 requires a 2/3 majority vote from the homeowners. Brenda's critical maintenance loophole was a complete and utter fabrication. There was no such loophole in the bylaws. This project, with its heavy machinery, labor, and planned decorative elements, was clearly going to cost far more than $10,000. They had knowingly and illegally bypassed the democratic process. But the real smoking gun, the legal concept that changed everything, was something I stumbled upon called the implied easement of ingress and egress. In plain English, it means that every homeowner has a fundamental, legally protected right to access and exit their own property. It's one of the most basic rights that comes with owning a home. No one, not even a seemingly all-powerful HOA, can legally block your access without providing a safe, reasonable alternative. They weren't just being difficult or negligent. They were actively violating one of my most basic property rights as a homeowner. Armed with this arsenal of legal ammunition, I contacted a lawyer specializing in HOA disputes. I found him through a State Bar Association referral service. He listened patiently on the phone as I breathlessly recounted the entire saga: the mat, the emails, the trench, the bridge, the fines, the water feature. He wasn't shocked. He was thrilled. "Oh, this is beautiful," he said, and I could hear the excitement in his voice. "This is a textbook case of gross negligence and board overreach. They haven't just stepped over the line. They've pole vaulted over it with a jetpack." He confirmed everything my research had suggested. The compounding fine was blatantly illegal. The lack of a homeowner vote was a clear breach of the bylaws, and blocking my access was a flagrant violation of property law. He agreed to draft a formal cease and desist letter on my behalf. The moment I hung up the phone, I felt a profound sense of relief inside me. I was no longer a victim cowering on an island. I was a plaintiff. The lawyer's letter was my nuclear weapon, but I knew that a single-person army was not enough. I needed allies. I needed the community. That evening, I drafted a concise, one-page summary of my findings. I used bullet points to lay out the HOA board's transgressions in simple, powerful terms: the illegal compounding fines, the bypassed homeowner vote, the violation of ingress and egress rights, and the massive liability risk the open, water-filled trench posed to every single homeowner's insurance and property value. I highlighted Bob the engineer's warnings about foundation damage and incorporated legal phrases from the lawyer's letter, such as breach of fiduciary duty and gross negligence. Then, armed with a stack of these flyers, I went door to door. I started with my immediate neighbors, the ones whose lawns were already showing signs of erosion. "They did this to me today," I'd say, holding up the summary and a picture of my mosquito-infested moat. "They did it without a vote, with our money, and completely against the law. Who do you think is next?" My engineer neighbor Bob joined me after the first few houses, lending his professional credibility to my cause. He would explain the technical dangers of the trench to anyone who would listen, his calm, expert demeanor cutting through any skepticism. The response was electric. People who had been quietly grumbling about Brenda's petty tyranny for years over lawn ornaments, mailbox colors, and basketball hoops were suddenly ready for a revolution. The trench wasn't just a problem for me anymore. It was a physical symbol of the HOA's unchecked power, a monument to their arrogance. I called for an emergency, unofficial community meeting to be held in my backyard 2 days before the next scheduled HOA board meeting. It felt like a revolutionary rally. Over 50 homeowners showed up, standing on the safe side of my moat, which served as a perfect dramatic backdrop. I passed out my flyers. Bob explained the engineering risks. We strategized. The official HOA board meeting was scheduled for 2 days, typically held in the clubhouse and attended by approximately 3 people, plus the board. This time, we all agreed would be different. On the night of the meeting, we arrived at the clubhouse as a unified force, 50 homeowners strong. We filed in silently and filled every single chair, with more people standing along the back wall. When Brenda and her 2 board cronies walked in, chatting amongst themselves, their smug expressions melted into looks of pure, undiluted panic. They weren't facing a lone dissenter. They were facing a rebellion. Brenda, visibly rattled, tapped the microphone and tried to start the meeting, her voice trembling slightly. "First on the agenda is the quarterly landscaping report." I stood up from my seat in the front row. "With all due respect, I think there's a more pressing issue to discuss," I said, my voice clear and steady, filling the silent, packed room. And then, one by one, I laid out our entire case. I read the specific bylaw that requires a homeowners to vote for any project exceeding $10,000. Was there a vote for this beautification project? I asked the room. A resounding chorus of no echoed back from the crowd. I detailed the illegal compounding fines they had tried to levy against me. I explained the fundamental right of ingress and egress. Finally, I held up the formal letter from my lawyer. This is a cease and desist letter and a formal demand to fill in that trench by the end of this week, I announced. If the demand is not met, the subsequent lawsuit will name not just the HOA, but each of you as individual board members for gross negligence. Brenda turned ghost white. She started to bluster about rules of order and agenda items, but her power had evaporated. The other two board members looked as though they were about to be physically ill. They were just regular homeowners, and they could now clearly see the personal, legal, and financial jeopardy Brenda had put them in. One of them began whispering frantically to the other. It was over in less than an hour. Facing a unified and furious community, a clear and present legal threat, and the mutiny of her own board, Brenda crumbled. Her terrified cronies, desperate to save themselves, immediately turned on her. They passed an emergency motion to halt the entire beautification project. They passed a second motion to accept all the terms of my lawyer's letter. They passed a third to formally rescind my fine and issue a public written apology to me. Brenda was outvoted and utterly humiliated. The very next morning, a new crew of workers arrived. They didn't have an excavator. They had dump trucks full of dirt. They filled the moat in a single day. The day after that, they returned and laid fresh, green sod over every inch of ground they had disturbed. It was all paid for out of the HOA's emergency reserve funds. Brenda resigned via a curt email that afternoon. Her reign was over. Standing on my front lawn now, you'd never know it was once a besieged island. The grass is green and seamless. My original welcome mat, the one with the criminally offensive font, is back in its rightful place. My dog, Buster, can once again chase squirrels all the way to the sidewalk without interruption. My mom can walk right up to my front door for our rescheduled lunch. It's quiet. It's peaceful. That month was an absolute nightmare, a surreal journey into the heart of petty tyranny. But it taught me something compelling. An HOA's power can feel absolute, but it isn't. Their authority is built on a foundation of rules, and those rules must comply with the law. More than that, they rely on the assumption that homeowners will be too busy, too tired, or too intimidated ever to question them. The moment you decide to do your research, to read your own governing documents, and to understand your rights truly, their entire structure of power begins to dissolve. And more importantly, the moment you knock on your neighbor's door and start talking, you realize you aren't alone. A single voice can be ignored, but a chorus of voices is impossible to dismiss. A community, united by a common purpose and armed with information, is the most powerful force there is. We fought back against an absurd injustice and we won. It wasn't just a victory against a trench. It was a victory for the simple, fundamental right to live peacefully in your own home, free from the whims of a delusional monarch. What's the most satisfying win you've ever had against petty rules or a power-tripping individual? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments. Let's celebrate those victories together. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe.